Welcome to the Authority File, the podcast that features conversations about the life cycle of scholarly communication. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. In this 4-episode series, we're revisiting the interdisciplinary field of comic studies. Our guests are Candida and Dom Davies. Candida is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, and Dom is reader in English at City St. George's, University of London. They've authored the book Graphic Refuge, Visuality and Mobility in Refugee Comics. The title is part of the Crossing Lines series published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press, which generously supports this series. You may recall the interview we did in April 2024 with Dale Jacobs, who wrote on comics and grief, which is also part of the Crossing Lines series. Graphic Refuge examines how comics, through art and narrative, portray the refugee experience and seek to humanize the representations of the displaced in our current mass media ecosystem. Further, the title explores the dynamics of what it means to be a citizen and/or a refugee. But before we get started, if you want to keep up on the latest programming from the Authority File podcast, you can subscribe to our monthly newsletter for information on the current and previous month's episodes. To subscribe, simply visit choice360.org, click on the newsletter sign-up banner in the top right corner, and select the Choice Podcast Updates option. While you're there, you can also sign up for other newsletters published by Choice. In this second episode of our series, we talk about how the book came together, learn more about the writers and artists who are profiled, and the ethical dynamics between artist and subject. Okay, yeah. So I want to take a closer look at the book Graphic Refuge, and maybe to start, Candida, can you talk about the origins of the book? Why was the writing process unique compared to other scholarly monographs?
Yeah, it is a different kind of process, but I'll start with how it all began. So I met Dom at a conference that he organized in 2017 at Oxford on, I think it was on travel and comics or comics and travel. And I was presenting there on a book called by Ting's Chak, who's a Chinese Canadian artist called Undocumented. The architecture of migrant detention, which we actually don't talk
Hmm.
about much in this book because we've both written about it in other places. But Dom and I just clicked at that conference. We had similar interests, similar ways of wanting to shift the way we read refugee comics in scholarship away from focusing on trauma and suffering and kind of individual stories to think more about the spaces and systems that we're seeing represented. So Dom and I, met there, and then he was editing a volume we called Documenting Trauma in Comics, and I came on board as a co-editor. And in that volume, we're really happy to have a kind of international set of contributors looking at all kinds of comics, mostly about war and conflict, but some about personal traumatizing experiences as well. And it turned out that Dom and I work together very well. Even though he's in London and I'm in the middle of Canada and Winnipeg, we have similar interests. I think we even have similar grammatical obsessions when it comes to editing other people's writing. And we get along really well. And so we were both working on similar comics and always showing up on the same panels at conferences because organizers would see the overlaps. I was always wondering, what's Dom up to? So it occurred to me, why not work together? And, academic publishing is quite competitive and hierarchical. And even though we're told all the time that collaborative research is valued, I think there is a strong emphasis on the solo authored monograph,
Hmm.
especially for people's first books. But Dom and I both already had those out and published. And so we decided to write this book together. But at some point, we realized that although we have similar interests, we actually have little separate pockets of interest. So, for instance, Dom's very interested in those Mediterranean crossings and those
Hmm.
sea journeys in comics. I'm very interested in camps and the representation of camps. They are, they overlap, but they're quite different sets of images and kinds of stories and kinds of experiences. So we decided rather than co-authoring, which would be that kind of back and forth over email or Zoom and editing each other's sentences and so on, the main part of the book would be separately written, and we would each write 3 of the 6 chapters. And then we would co-write an introduction and an epilogue. And along the way, we realized that each of our chapters worked with another one of the other person's chapter. So we could subdivide the book into 3 sections. And we've kept our names on those chapters, but we cross-reference each other. And I refer to Dom as Davies in the third person. But sometimes when we write together in the intro and epilogue, we refer to ourselves as we. So that's my view on it, but I'll throw it to Dom to add in.
I mean, I think we wrote this book over. I remember writing a first draft of one of the first chapters in the very first summer of the first COVID lockdown. So, which feels to me like over a long time, and it was really great to work collaboratively over that time. So it took us about 5 years to bring this to finish, to finish the book from the kind of the first drafts through to the final publication. And, we both had personal things going on in that time. We were both grappling with COVID, different life events come up. And it was really refreshing to be able to sort of hand across the baton to someone else who you really trusted. Candida and I completely trust Candida to move the project forward. And, if you're working on your own and you can't work on something for 6 months, you come back to it and nothing's happened. But actually, with what was lovely is that I would, maybe go and fulfill some other obligations for 6 months and come back, and Candida would have moved the whole project on. And that would be so exciting and inspirational. Then that would spur me to do the same. And so we had a really great back and forth. So yeah, we keep those chapters sort of individually named, but it's really a dialogue. And I think, as one of our peer reviewers pointed out, actually, that that dialogism, that kind of dialogic form, the idea of that this is a conversation, is really sort of woven into the book in so many ways, in the sense that comics are a relationship between artists and readers, or a conversation, more than other texts in some ways. And obviously, there's the conversations within the book that we're joining with other comics critics. So, yeah, we really value that structure, and I think it comes through in the sort of final manuscript.
Yeah, that's a really cool observation. I like that. So are the writers and artists that you choose to include in the book, are they people with lived experiences as refugees? And then, if an author is not a refugee, what are the implications of an artist communicating a refugee's story? Candida, I'll go to you on that one.
Sure. Maybe I'll answer your first question and then Dom can answer the second one. Because that question of what are the implications of a non-refugee artist telling this story, that's kind of our other big ethical and theoretical question in the book, alongside with who are these comics for. So in terms of are they people with lived experience, it's a mix. So we certainly have artists and writers in the book who have experience being refugees or are second generation. They might have been left their home country as children or babies, and they've grown up in households in the UK, US, Australia, Canada, with that experience kind of overshadowing all their lives. So we consider them to be part of the refugee experience as well. But in terms of people we look at, Hamid Suleiman, whose Freedom Hospital is a book that Dom looks at, and Marwa Al-Sabani, whose memoir, The Battle for Home. Both of these are people who have lived through Syrian conflict and displacement. We also, Dom looks at Marwan Hisham's Brothers of the Gun, which is illustrated by Molly Crabapple. That's a great example of a collaboration between a refugee artist and a non-refugee, or a refugee writer and a non-refugee artist. And then in the final chapter, I look at the second generation. So Dom's already mentioned the US Palestinian artist Leila Abdelrazak and her wonderful memoir Badawi, of her father's time in a Lebanese camp in the 50s and 60s and 70s. And then perhaps one of the best known graphic narratives we look at is the autobiography The Best We Could Do by Thi Bui, who's a Vietnamese American artist. And that has been very widely read and critically acclaimed. And The Best We Could Do has been part of some of those mass reading events, like One Book, One City, or librarian or university organized reading events. And then alongside Thi Bui, I look at a perhaps lesser known Vietnamese Australian artist, now based in New York, Matt Huynh, who publishes a lot of work online about his childhood suburb, Cabramatta, which is on the outskirts of Sydney, Australia. And it was kind of a heroin capital, a drug sort of fueled neighborhood during his childhood that has since been cleaned up and gentrified. But a lot of the xenophobia and racism directed towards Vietnamese refugees in Australia also came with the idea that they brought criminality and gangs and the drug trade. And he has a very different perception of that neighborhood, having been a refugee child there. For him, even the members of those Vietnamese gangs who were young people, he treats them with great empathy because he sees how they were neglected and they were kind of left to fend for themselves because they were teenagers when they fled Vietnam. So we certainly have that firsthand and secondhand experience. And then we have another group of artists in the book, like Sarah Glidden, who's a Jewish American cartoonist, and her book Rolling Blackouts is based on her joining some journalists traveling through Iraq and visiting people who were displaced and considered refugees. And we also have people like Olivier Kugler, who I've already mentioned, who went into camps in Syria, Syrian refugee camps in the Middle East and Europe, sponsored by Doctors Without Borders. So we have a range of people, and there are really important questions about that relationship when we have a non-refugee artist telling or drawing refugee stories. It's really one of the big questions we have in the book, because we wanted to think about the ethics of that relationship and what we see on the pages as a result. So I'll throw it to Dom to pick up on that.
Sure.
Yeah, so in terms of comics that are made by artists or artist-journalists who are not themselves refugees, but who are, for instance, traveling through refugee camps and interviewing refugees, or who are volunteering or have been commissioned by MSF to go and make some comics that sort of bring refugee stories to life. Or indeed, like the example of Sarah Glidden, who I will come back to in a moment, who travels with a group of journalists through Turkey, Iraq and Syria, and sort of documents their process of documenting refugee stories. It's really, it's very, very common, and it's very, very frequent and very, very powerful and big part of the refugee comics genre. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I think one of the main ones is that comics scholars talk about how comics allow us to see things twice, right? We always see things twice in comics. We see the first story, but then also because comics are made up of frames, that we see that what they're showing us, but also what they're not showing us. We also see how we're seeing. So we kind of see ourselves seeing in a certain way, right? So it's a very self-conscious medium. It's a kind of what we might think of as a meta-narratological medium. So it's a it has the narrative, but it also has the meta-narrative. So it has the story, but also how the story was composed. So it allows people to reflect on the way in which they've gathered refugee stories, whilst also including those refugee stories as well. And the most extreme example here is Sarah Glidden's Rolling Blackouts, which I am completely fascinated by and dedicate a whole chapter to this one book. I mean, the book is like 400 pages, so it is totally deserving of its own chapter. But I go very, very deep. So that middle chapter is for real nerds of and fans of Sarah Glidden. But what Glidden does is she kind of that whole book. There are refugee testimonies in it. There's at the very center of the book is this kind of long interview with an Iraqi refugee, Samuel Kandi, who went to the US and was given refuge, and then who was deported back to Iraq on suspected terrorism charges. And what's really interesting is she's interested in that interview, but she's not just interested in telling Samuel Kandi's story. She's really interested in the way in which the journalists go about gathering his story, and how actually even the journalists are a bit like the kind of FBI interrogators that deported Samuel Kandi, because they can't help, but they've got an idea of the story they want in their minds that will sell in the newspapers, right? And so even though they say they're there to be transparent, we watch as they start to interrogate him, they start to pressure him into certain answers, certain kind of lines of inquiry that he doesn't want to answer. And he, on several occasions, just says, no, I'm just not going to talk about that, or I'm not going to go give you the line that you want. So we start to see this much richer tapestry of kind of, it's not a transparent window onto the refugee life world. It's actually a real sense of the politics around gathering these stories and the kind of the difficulties of that kind of mode of graphic reportage.
Hmm. And then what about in certain instances where it's the person who's either drawing or writing the comic where the interviewee may not want to talk to that person about their experience or share it. Um, how do the artists navigate those dynamics?
Well, I'll continue with Sarah Glidden, and then I'm sure Candida can offer some examples too. There's a very famous, or very kind of climactic scene of Sarah Glidden's role in Blackouts, where she's in a kind of refugee center, and she's talking to a refugee, an Iraqi refugee who's been displaced to Syria. This is before the Syrian war broke out, there is a translator translating the words between Glidden, the journalist and the refugee. And Sarah Glidden writes whenever the refugee speaks in Arabic. Sarah Glidden writes the speech in Arabic and then writes the translator's balloon in English, so we can see the kind of act of translation. And then we see moments when the translator either is unable to translate, or because of what the refugee says as being quite offensive and being like, leave me alone, you don't understand what you're here for, you don't understand what you're doing, the translator chooses not to translate. So there's this moment on the page where the reader can see that the refugee has said something, but if they're an Anglophone reader, doesn't immediately know what that is. And they can choose to go and decode it if they want to, but it's this moment of kind of untranslatability, really, of kind of like, that you can't actually have knowledge to you don't have the right to know everything that a refugee is feeling and saying all of the time. And that's a very humbling experience.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just add that there are lots of different tools comics can provide for this situation, right? So comics are made up of words and images, and some artists can choose to not draw someone who doesn't want to be drawn, but still get their experience and their testimony across in words if they want. So we talk in the book about refugee refusal, which is a kind of agency for someone who is a refugee who has had all their power taken away from them to say to a reporter or a comics artist, I'm not going to tell you my story. I don't trust you with it. Or I can't tell you my story because I might be deported or I might be arrested if I'm discovered through your representation of me. I have something really important at stake here. My life is at stake, and you're trying to make a comic out of it. So a lot of these questions come up. And one thing I'll just say in reference to Sarah Glidden is she's in this kind of genre of comics journalism. And really, since Joe Sacco developed his kind of father of comics journalism through books like Palestine and Footnotes in Gaza, he goes to conflict zones. He always draws himself in the panels. And that's kind of coming out of American new journalism, people like Truman Capote and Joan Didion, telling us journalism is not objective. It's a subjective experience. They write about their own feelings about what they're reporting on. And comics really have picked up on that and do it visually. So Joe Sacco always draws himself and Sarah Glidden draws herself. And I think that's really become the kind of standard convention for comics journalists to remind us this is not any kind of authoritative, objective point of view on the story. I'm a witness and I'm going to draw myself witnessing. And sometimes I might draw myself not understanding or actually interfering in the situation in a negative way. But one example I'll give of this refugee refusal is in Olivier Kugler's Escaping Wars and Waves. Most of the book is made up of portraits of people he's met who want their portraits drawn and they want to tell their story. They want the world to know what they've been through. And they also want the world to know they're not just a refugee, that they were a trained psychologist who worked with children with autism in Syria, perhaps, as one woman does. And now she's working in the camp with people who are traumatized. She's skilled, she's educated, she's helping other people at the same time that she's separated from her husband and children, and she doesn't know what the future holds. So we see a lot of this kind of thickening of refugees' experiences through their faces and portraits. But at one point, towards the end of the book, when he's in the Calais camp in North France, Kugler has a whole page and he calls it The Afghan. And he tells us he met a young man who was from Afghanistan, who didn't want his picture drawn and didn't want his name revealed, and maybe didn't even want his story made public. And Kugler writes this out in words, but doesn't draw the man's face. Instead, he draws the ferries and the ports that he's been through as he's been trying to leave Calais and get to the UK. But at the very bottom of the page, he draws a tiny little miniature version, It's almost like a Where's Waldo? Like, where is this man? Can't see his face. He's about 2 millimeters high, and he puts an arrow to him and tells us this is the man. So it's a complicated page to read because on the one hand, we're being told he didn't want his story known. I'm making his story known by telling you he didn't want it known and why. And I'm going to facilitate his anonymity by not drawing his face, but I'm going to show you he is a real person, but draw him in really tiny scale walking away from us. It's a very self-reflexive page. And it's a page I'm a little bit uneasy with still because I'm not sure the artist always has the right to draw people who say they don't want to be drawn, even if they do these kind of comics type tricks using words, not drawing their faces. But it's certainly something I think all of the artists we look at reflect on in the work itself.
Yeah, that's fantastic, and it's so fascinating because when you were talking about the sort of comics journalism and sort of adopting journalistic techniques, one of the things in journalism is, are you on the record or off the record, or you don't just automatically allow someone, or give someone or expose somebody if they don't really want to be, if they're giving you some sensitive information. So yeah, I mean, I think it sounds like that dynamic persists through even, some of the more creative aspects of the medium.
And just to add very quickly, for when it comes to the specific question of refugees, asylum seekers, migrants, this is a really urgent question because being photographed can put if you're someone who's arrived in Southern Europe and you're trying to get further into Europe, if you're kind of photographed in Greece, you'll be forced to claim asylum there. Conversely, if you're photographed in Germany and your asylum application is rejected and you're sent back to, say, Syria, your life could be in danger. Your family might be put in danger. This isn't just a kind of like, do you or not want to be represented? It's a really kind of immediate sort of, in some cases, life or death question. Yeah.
You just heard from Candida Rifkind and Dominic Davies. Candida is a professor in the Department of English at the University of Winnipeg, and Dom is reader in English at City St. George's, University of London. They're co-authors of the book Graphic Refuge, Visuality and Mobility in Refugee Comics. This episode was brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. Join us next week when we get into the journalistic characteristics of refugee comics, how they can be a tool for political change, and how they're uniquely able to visualize the physical space of refugee camps. As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising director, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.